We're going to speak today about the influence of modernism, looking at one of my lectures and some of the material in my course on modern Roman Catholicism and the Reformation. I'm trying to update our view. I think that a lot of Reformed people have an outdated view of Roman Catholicism that's probably from 500 years ago when the Reformation occurred. But even then, sometimes the average person might even have a caricatured view that is 500 years old. So not only is it old and outdated, so to speak, but it might have been a caricature to begin with. So it's helpful to understand, Rome's positions, and also to understand the different positions within Rome and the changes that have occurred to the Roman Catholic Church over the last 500 plus years, and understand how the Reformation and the principles of the Reformation apply to those developments. My goal and my intent, and certainly my conclusions at the end of the course, are not that there needs to be some rapprochement between Rome and the Reformation, that the Reformation is no longer significant or important, but rather that the principles of the Reformation, especially the five solas, and are more significant and more important today than perhaps they even were back in 1517. But what's interesting is when we zoom in on the history, looking specifically at the early 20th century, we start to see the changing, tides in culture. Modernism comes in, and it affected not just theology, but it affected industry, it affected secular philosophy, it affected art and culture in a whole host of ways. And it certainly had an effect not only on American Presbyterianism, as many of us are familiar with the modernist fundamentalist debates, but also had an effect on Roman Catholicism. And paralleling those two, I think, is really interesting and insightful. Jim, do you know about much of this stuff? Or, typically, at least in my experience, I came to seminary, and I didn't come from a liberal arts background. I was a Bachelor of Science and ended up doing a business and computer kind of hybrid degree in college and had to take my gen eds. But discussing modernism and postmodernism were generally not things that I did at university. What about you at St. Anselm?
Yeah, I was a philosophy major in college, and so the curriculum that we had was a very helpful one that laid out a history of philosophy. So you took the history of philosophy over the course of 4 courses, I guess it was. And then on top of that, you had focused studies topically, so a class on metaphysics and epistemology or what have you. And then in addition to that, you would have specialized classes. So you can take classes in Thomas Aquinas, for example, was a popular class because at a Catholic college, the number of the faculty there were specialists, and Thomas, he was the big one there on campus. And so,
as it were,
yeah. And so but then I was able to get a really good, in addition to that, sense of modern philosophy, and that was interesting, of course. So yeah, we were having conversations along those lines, and modernism is a very distinct time within Western intellectual thought, most broadly, and how that relates, though, to Catholicism is something that I'm mostly ignorant about. And that's where we could really learn from you. The 19th and 20th century developments in Roman Catholicism is something that, I don't have an academic understanding of, in the sense that I grew up in 20th century, late 20th century Roman Catholicism gives me an existential kind of insight into modern Catholicism, but I don't have the academic insights.
But you are experientially an expert in how the Rosary and the Our Fathers relate to the performance of the Mets and the Giants.
Yeah. No, the harder I prayed the Rosary, the worse the Mets got, and so I took that as being the fact that the Mets are the Protestant team.
It's the most powerful apologetic yet.
Yeah, well, I've told you my theory, right? That the that the Mets are the OPC version of New York baseball sports, and that's because we're sort of the lovable losers. We are the ones who are sort of the second team in the city, and but faithful and passionate and committed to all the right things.
Yeah, well, I may dispute about half of what you said right there, but I can appreciate some of that, and I just at least need to make note that lovable losers is a trademark of the Chicago Cubs, we should say, but at least it ought to be. Yeah, I'm no expert on modernism and 20th century Catholicism, but I have done significant amount of reading there, and especially on my doctoral work on Karl Rahner. He's right in the mix of it. And I'm doing some work and research right now on nature and grace in 20th century Catholicism in advance of our Reformed Forum Conference, which is coming up at the beginning of October, right near you, Jim, and in Pflugerville, Texas. So if anyone's listening and would like to come on over to Texas, we'd love to see you. You can register for that at reformedforum.org/conference. So we won't get too much into nature and grace. We might have an episode on that at some point after I nail a few things down in my research. But I mean, at least as Presbyterians, we typically speak of modernism and fundamentalism from the perspective of the Presbyterian side of things, and there's a lot to be said there. But there are parallel developments in Roman Catholicism, which I think are quite instructive for us. And, you know, obviously in the grand scheme of world Christian history, American Presbyterianism is a tiny sliver compared to what was going on in Rome. So, you know, even though this is more familiar, the American Presbyterianism is more familiar history to you and to me and to many of our listeners, and we hear of the modernist fundamentalist debates or you know, controversy, everyone that's been around for any length of time knows at least the broad sketch of that history. Well, I mean, the world doesn't. So we want to at least get the perspective right. It might be more appropriate to say that American Presbyterianism, the mainline Presbyterianism, paralleled Catholicism rather than the other way around, but people can get my point. So modernism really was a development that flowed out of the Enlightenment, which itself was an 18th century culture movement away from tradition, faith, and revelation, of course. And after the Enlightenment, a lot of people started to place a real huge emphasis on human reason. So this is some like Civ 101 type stuff, Western Civ. And this rediscovery of man's natural ability led to a number of different theological positions. It had an effect on everything, industry, culture, art, I said, but it had a huge effect upon theology. And we certainly don't have time today to explore all these developments in philosophy and theology, but at least I want to take a moment to focus on the significant movement in Catholicism and the Reformation from pre-modern times through modernism and its battles, and then what happened in the 20th century after the church was forced to reckon with these modernistic tendencies. So, I don't know. What would you say, Jim, in terms of your experience with Barth regarding modernism? Because in large measure, the American Presbyterianism solved, quote unquote, solved its problem with modernism by turning to Barth.